The coastal town of Port Haven was usually a place where the loudest sound was the seagulls fighting over French fries near the pier. It was a quiet Tuesday morning, but today the square was packed. People were standing on benches, craning their necks, and holding up their phones. In the center of all the attention was a grand piano that looked too expensive to be sitting outside on cobblestones, and a man sitting at it who looked even more expensive. This man was Julian Voss. To the world, he was a genius. To the classical music critics, he was a god. He had toured every major city, played for royalty, and sold millions of records. He was also known for being incredibly difficult. If the theater was 2 degrees too warm, he walked out. If the audience coughed too much, he stopped playing. He was not a man who mixed well with regular people, and he certainly didn't look like he was enjoying his time in a small beach town. Julian was in the middle of a press conference, but it wasn't going well. A reporter from a local paper, a young guy with a notebook and not much fear, had just asked a question that struck a nerve. The reporter had suggested that Julian's music was technically perfect, but emotionally empty, and that his new album was so complex that only other professors could enjoy it. He asked Julian if he thought he had lost touch with the common person. The silence that followed was heavy. Julian stopped adjusting his microphone. He looked at the reporter, then at the crowd of locals, fishermen, shopkeepers, teenagers on skateboards, and a look of pure annoyance crossed his face. He didn't like being challenged, especially not by someone who probably bought sheet music at a discount store. "That is a ridiculous question," Julian said, his voice sharp and cutting through the ocean breeze. "You call it emotionally empty because you do not possess the education to understand the complexity. You think music is about a simple melody you can hum in the shower? Real art is difficult. It is supposed to be hard." The reporter didn't back down. "So you're saying a regular person couldn't understand your music? Or play it?" Julian let out a laugh that was short and mocking. He turned to face the cameras fully now. He saw an opportunity. He loved proving people wrong. He loved showing the world why he was on the stage, and they were in the seats. "I am saying," Julian said, gesturing to the crowd, "that true talent is 1 in a million. The education required to perform my work takes decades. A baker cannot just put down his flour and play a sonata. A waitress cannot serve coffee and then perform The Tempest." He tapped the cover of the thick book of sheet music sitting on the piano rack. It was his newest, hardest composition, a piece that gave even concertmasters nightmares. "I will prove it to you," Julian announced, his voice rising. The crowd leaned in. "I am staying here for 1 more day. I issue a challenge. I don't care who you are. If you can come up here tomorrow at noon and play the first 3 pages of this piece," he slapped the music book flawlessly, "I will donate every cent of my profit from this tour to the charity of your choice. Every cent." The crowd gasped. That amount of money was life-changing. But Julian added, his eyes narrowing, "If you fail, and you will fail, you have to stand on this stage and tell the world that you were wrong. That art is not for amateurs." He stood up, dusted off his expensive suit jacket, and walked away from the microphone, leaving the challenge hanging in the salty air. His bodyguard stepped in to usher him to his car, but the excitement in the square didn't die down. People were arguing. Some were angry at his arrogance, others agreeing that no normal person could do it. Standing near the back of the crowd, leaning against the brick wall of an old bakery, was Alina. She was 25 years old. Wearing a faded blue apron that had the logo of Sweet Crumbs stitched on the pocket, her hair was tied back in a messy bun, and there was a smear of vanilla frosting on her cheek that she hadn't noticed yet. She had just stepped out for a minute to get some fresh air from the ovens. She hadn't meant to listen to a speech by a famous pianist, but as she stood there wiping her hands on a towel, she felt a strange bubbling in her chest. It wasn't just anger at his tone, though that was part of it. It was the music. Alina wasn't a pianist. Not really. She had never been to a conservatory. She couldn't read the complex Italian terms that Julian probably used in his sleep. But she had a secret. Since she was a little girl, hiding in her grandmother's damp basement, she had played. It started on an old radio, then a cheap keyboard her dad found at a garage sale, and finally, her grandmother's upright piano. It was out of tune, the ivory was chipped, and the pedals stuck, but it was her best friend. She played by ear. She could hear a song, once a pop song on the radio, a commercial jingle, classical piece in a movie, and her fingers just knew where to go. It wasn't a skill she advertised. It was just something she did to breathe. It was how she dealt with the stress of rent, of being lonely, of feeling like she was just another face in the crowd at her boring job. Now, listening to Julian tell her and everyone like her that they were incapable of understanding real art, something inside her snapped. She looked at the shiny black piano on the stage. It looked terrifying, but it also looked like home. "I'll do it," a voice shouted from the crowd. Alina turned her head. It was a guy from the local high school, probably a band student. He was laughing with his friends. He was joking. "No, seriously, I could do that," another person yelled. But they were laughing too. To the crowd, this was entertainment. It was a spectacle. It was a joke. Julian Voss was a clown to them, and they were heckling him. But Alina didn't laugh. She looked back at the stage. The piano sat there, silent and mocking. She thought about The Tempest. She had actually heard a recording of it a few months ago on YouTube late one night. It was fast, frantic, and incredibly sad. She remembered trying to play the melody on her keyboard at home, struggling with the speed but getting the notes right eventually. Could she really do it? The fear gripped her stomach. If she went up there and failed, everyone would see. She would be humiliated. She wasn't a performer. She was a bakery assistant who sometimes burned the cookies. She liked being invisible, but then she thought about the way Julian looked at the reporter, the way he looked at the crowd, like they were dirt beneath his shoes, the way he said that art wasn't for people like her. She looked down at her hands. They were rough from handling dough and scrubbing pans, but they were also the hands that had played Moonlight Sonata at her grandmother's funeral. When she couldn't afford a real musician, they were the hands that coaxed beauty out of a broken, dusty piano. Alina took a step forward, then another. The crowd was thick, but she squeezed through, smelling the mix of perfume, hot dogs, and ocean air. She got closer to the front. She could see the sheet music sitting on the rack, the pages fluttering slightly in the wind. She didn't go up to the stage. Not yet. Her heart was beating so hard she thought it might bruise her ribs. She wasn't ready to scream out, "I accept." In front of 100 people and a camera, that wasn't her style. Instead, she stood right in the front row, where the security guards wouldn't let anyone pass. She looked at the spot where Julian had been standing. The reporters were packing up their gear, discussing where to go for lunch. The crowd was starting to thin out, the excitement fading as the celebrity left. Alina stayed there. She locked her eyes on the piano. She made a silent promise to it. She wasn't doing this for the money, although that would be nice. She wasn't doing this for fame. She was doing it to prove that feelings didn't come from a university degree. She was doing it because music belonged to everyone who felt it, not just the people who could afford to buy a grand piano. A man standing next to her noticed her staring. He was wearing a fishing hat and looked bored. "You gonna go up there, honey?" he asked with a chuckle. "You look like you're going to attack it." Lena looked at him, surprised. She realized she was clenching her fists. She relaxed her hands and wiped the frosting off her cheek. "No," she said softly. Her voice was calm, much calmer than she felt. "I'm just going to come back tomorrow." The fisherman laughed. "Good luck with that. That guy is a machine. Nobody is going to beat him." Alina didn't argue. She just smiled a small, tired smile. She turned around and walked back toward the bakery. The bell on the door chimed as she pushed it open, and the smell of sugar and yeast wrapped around her like a warm blanket. "Where have you been, Alina?" her boss yelled from the back. "The cinnamon rolls are burning." Alina tied her apron tighter. "I'm sorry," she called back. "I was busy." She washed her hands at the big metal sink, scrubbing off the invisible grime of the outside world. As the water ran over her fingers, she flexed them. She visualized the keys. She visualized the notes. She didn't know if she could win. She didn't know if her ear was good enough to tackle the complexity of Julian's written score without practicing it for months. But She knew she couldn't let him win without a fight. "I'll see you tomorrow," she whispered to no one. The clock on the wall ticked loudly. It was 24 hours until Judgment Day. Alina pulled a tray of bread from the oven, her face hot from the heat, but her mind already cold and focused on the performance to come. She was just a simple woman with a simple life, but in 24 hours, she was going to make the world listen. The sun went down over Port Haven, bringing the usual quiet of the seaside town. But inside Elena's small apartment, the air was thick with tension. She lived in a studio above a laundromat, a place that smelled constantly of soap in the sea. It wasn't glamorous, and it wasn't quiet. The washing machines downstairs often rumbled and thumped, shaking the floorboards. Tonight, however, the noise was the least of her worries. Alina sat at her desk, the glow of her laptop illuminating her tired face. She had spent her entire savings from the last 3 months on a used printer and a fresh ream of paper. She pulled up the digital version of The Tempest. It took forever to load, and when the pages finally appeared on the screen, they looked intimidating. The notes were tiny black ants crawling all over the staff lines. There were sharps and flats everywhere, clusters of notes that looked like they were stacked on top of each other, time signatures that changed every few bars. She pressed print. The printer groaned and squeaked, spitting out page after page. When she held the stack of paper in her hands, it felt heavy. Heavier than music should feel, she whispered to herself. "Let's see what you're made of." She cleared the books and coffee mugs off the small keyboard in the corner. It was an electric piano she had bought secondhand years ago. The keys were slightly yellowed, and the middle C stuck if you pressed it too hard. It was a toy compared to the grand piano sitting in the town square. It was definitely nothing like what Julian Voss played in concert halls. She placed the sheet music on the little stand. She took a deep breath, flexing her fingers. She cracked her knuckles, a nervous habit she had since she was a child. Then she started. The first measure was a disaster. Her brain saw the sharp symbol on the E, but her fingers forgot, hitting the white key. The sound clashed, ugly and wrong. She stopped. She tried again. This time, she remembered the sharp, but she stumbled over the rhythm. It was supposed to be fast, a flurry of notes like a storm hitting the shore. But she was playing it like she was walking through mud. An hour passed, then 2 hours. Alina felt a headache starting to form behind her eyes. She looked at the clock. It was past midnight. She had to be up at 4 in the morning to start the dough at the bakery. She was exhausted just thinking about it. "This is impossible," she said out loud. The empty room echoed her words. She stood up and walked to the window, looking down at the dark street. A lone car drove by, its headlights cutting through the fog. She felt a sudden wave of doubt wash over her. Who was she kidding? She wasn't a pianist. She was a baker. Julian Voss was right. This music was for people who had dedicated their entire lives to it. People who practiced 8 hours a day in climate-controlled rooms. She was just a girl with a keyboard and a stubborn streak. She turned around and looked at the papers sitting on the music stand. They seemed to mock her. The Tempest. It was a perfect name because she felt like she was in the middle of one, tossed around by waves of insecurity and fear. She sat back down, defeated. She put her hands in her lap. "I'm sorry," she whispered, not knowing if she was apologizing to herself or to her grandmother. Had always told her she had a gift. She stared at the wall, her eyes unfocused. She started humming. She didn't mean to. It just happened. She hummed the melody she had heard on the recording earlier. It was a fast, frantic tune, but underneath the speed, there was a deep sadness. It sounded like someone crying while running away from something. Alina stopped humming. She looked at the sheet music again. She had been trying to read every single note. She was trying to count one onda, two onda in her head, obsessing over the technical math of it. That was how she thought you were supposed to play. That was how the professionals did it, but she didn't know the math. She only knew the feeling. She closed her eyes. She blocked out the sound of the washing machines downstairs. She blocked out the image of Julian Voss's arrogant face. She tried to find the emotion in the music again. She remembered the first time she heard it. It made her feel lonely, but a strong kind of lonely. Like standing on a cliff edge with the wind blowing your hair, screaming at the ocean. Elena opened her eyes. She didn't look at the individual notes anymore. She looked at the shape of the phrase. She let her hands hover over the keys. She played. She missed a few notes in the run, yes. Her fingering was sloppy according to any textbook. But the timing changed. It wasn't rigid. It flowed. She slowed down on the sad parts, letting the notes hang in the air like smoke. And then she sped up on the chaotic parts, letting her fingers fly like they were possessed. The sound coming from the little yellow keyboard was different than before. It wasn't perfect, but it was alive. Elena felt a shiver go down her spine. She played the first page. Then the second. She wasn't reading the music as much as she was using it as a map, checking her location but following her own path. She realized that Julian Voss played with his head perfect, cold, calculated. She had to play with her heart. The hours ticked away. Her eyes burned from fatigue, and her back ached from hunching over the keyboard. Her fingers started to hurt, cramping up in unfamiliar positions. She ignored it all. Around 3 a.m., she played the section that had been giving her the most trouble. It was a series of jumps for the left hand, wide leaps that required precision. She had missed it every single time. She took a sip of cold coffee sitting on the table. "It's not a jump," she muttered. "It's a heartbeat." She stopped trying to land the note perfectly. She just felt the rhythm of it. She threw her left hand out, trusting her muscle memory. Her thumb hit the key with a solid thud. It was in tune. It was right. A tired smile spread across her face. She did it again. And again. Each time, it got a little smoother. The sun began to peek through the curtains, casting a gray light over the room. Elena looked at the clock. It was 4:15 a.m. She had to leave for the bakery in 15 minutes. She hadn't slept at all. She looked at her hands. They were trembling slightly. Her fingertips were sore. She stood up and stretched, her joints popping. She felt dizzy, but there was a strange energy buzzing under her skin. She carefully took the sheet music off the stand. She folded the pages and tucked them into her bag, right next to her lunchbox. She looked at the keyboard one last time. It looked old and tired in the morning light, just like she felt. "Thanks for the help," she whispered. She washed her face in the small bathroom, splashing cold water on her cheeks to wake herself up. She looked in the mirror. There were dark circles under her eyes. She looked like a zombie. No one would look at her and see a hero. They would see a tired woman who probably hadn't had her coffee yet. She pulled her hair back into a tighter bun, put on her cleanest apron, and headed out the door. The morning air was crisp and biting. The streets were empty, save for a few stray cats and the early risers heading to the docks. The walk to the bakery felt different. Usually Elena just walked with her head down, thinking about what she had to do. That day mix the dough, turn the oven, frost the cakes. Today her mind was racing through arpeggios and chords. She was humming the melody of the Tempest under her breath. Matching her footsteps to the rhythm, she got to the bakery and unlocked the heavy wooden door. The familiar smell of yeast greeted her. It was comforting. It was home. She tied her apron strings behind her back. It was her armor. For the next 6 hours, Elena worked on autopilot. She needed dough that felt softer and more cooperative than the stubborn sheet music she had battled all night. She decorated cakes with steady hands. Even though her heart was hammering a nervous rhythm against her ribs, her boss came in around 8 a.m. He took one look at her and frowned. "You look terrible, Elena. Are you sick? You can go home if you need to." Elena paused, holding a bag of flour. She thought about lying. She could say she had the flu. She could go home, hide under the covers, and forget about the challenge. She could let Julian Voss win and go back to her simple, safe life.
Oh.
"No," Elena said. Her voice was raspy, but firm. "I'm not sick. I'm just thinking about something big today." Her boss shrugged, not pressing it. "Well, don't burn the muffins." By 11 a.m., the bakery was crowded with the lunch rush. People were ordering sandwiches and coffee, chatting about their days. The local radio was playing in the background. The DJ came on, reminding everyone about the big event at the square. "Don't forget, folks," the DJ chirped. "Julian Voss's challenge is happening at noon. Is anyone brave enough to take him up on it? Or will our piano genius leave town with his wallet intact? A customer at the counter, a woman in a business suit, laughed as she paid for her coffee. I hope someone goes up there just to wipe that smug look off his face. But honestly, I bet nobody does. Who has that kind of talent? Alina forced a smile as she handed the woman her receipt. You never know, she said softly. The clock ticked toward 11:30 a.m. Alina took off her apron and hung it on the hook. She washed her hands one last time, scrubbing away the flour and sugar. She looked at her reflection in the back of the toaster. She looked pale. She walked out from behind the counter. Hey, boss, she called out. I need to take my lunch break now. He asked, surprised. It's the rush. It's important, she said. She pushed open the bakery door and stepped out into the sunlight. The town square was 2 blocks away. She could hear the hum of the crowd growing louder. She could hear the distant sound of a microphone being tested, a screech of feedback that made her stomach lurch. Alina gripped the strap of her bag. She felt the crinkled edges of the sheet music inside. She wasn't a prodigy. She hadn't slept. She was terrified. But as she walked toward the noise, she realized she wasn't walking toward a competition. She was walking toward the truth. And that was more important than being perfect. The town square looked completely different than it had the day before. Yesterday, it was just a place where people walked their dogs or waited for the bus. Today, it looked like a stadium. A temporary stage had been set up right in the center, blocked off by metal barricades. Cables ran across the cobblestones like black snakes, connecting massive speakers to the power grid. Police officers stood casually by the edges. Just in case the crowd got too wild, there were hundreds of people squeezed into the open space. Tourists who had heard about the challenge online were mixed in with the locals. News vans from the big cities were parked on the sidewalk, their satellite dishes pointed toward the sky. A large screen had been erected so the people in the back could see what was happening on stage. The energy was electric, a buzzing mixture of curiosity and excitement. Alina stood at the edge of the crowd, clutching her bag to her chest. She felt small, insignificant. She was still wearing her work clothes, stark slacks, and a plain white button-down shirt. Her hair was pulled back in that tight, practical bun. She looked like she had just finished a shift, which she had. She didn't look like a musician. She didn't look like she belonged anywhere near a stage. On the big screen, she could see Julian Vross. He was sitting in a comfortable chair next to the piano, sipping from a bottle of expensive water. He looked relaxed. He looked bored. He was checking his watch, tapping his foot, likely wondering why he was wasting his time in this small town when he could be practicing for his real concerts in Vienna or London. All right. Settle down. A man's voice boomed over the speakers. It was the mayor, a portly man who looked very happy to be on TV. It is noon. The moment of truth has arrived. A cheer went up from the crowd. The cameras zoomed in on the stage. The mayor gestured toward the piano. Mr. Vross has issued his challenge, the mayor continued. 3 pages of his masterpiece, The Tempest. Flawless performance required. Is there anyone in Port Havenor anywhere who dares to step forward? The crowd went quiet for a moment. People looked around at each other. A few teenagers near the front shouted, "Go for it!" But no one moved. It was a terrifying prospect. To walk up there alone, in front of all those people, and try to play music that even experts found difficult. It was madness. The silence stretched on, heavy and awkward. Julian stood up. He walked to the microphone with a lazy grace. He adjusted the stand so it was the perfect height for him. He looked out at the sea of faces, a small smug smile playing on his lips. As I thought, Julian said into the mic. His voice was smooth, polished, and incredibly arrogant. Passion is easy to talk about, but it is very hard to produce when it actually matters. People love to criticize the greats, but they disappear when asked to stand on the pedestal. A ripple of murmurs went through the crowd. People didn't like being called cowards. But the fear of failure was stronger than their pride. Julian signaled to his assistant, who walked over and handed him the sheet music. Julian placed it on the rack of the grand piano, smoothing out the pages with a deliberate motion. I will give you 5 more minutes, Julian announced, looking at his watch again. After that, I declared this town musically bankrupt. I will play a short piece myself as a consolation prize for your time, and then I will leave. He sat down at the bench. He cracked his knuckles. He was preparing to show off, to play something brilliant that would remind everyone why he was the master and they were just the audience. Alina felt her heart hammering against her ribs. This was it. The window was closing. If she didn't move now, she would go back to the bakery. She would go back to making cinnamon rolls and sweeping floors. And deep down, she knew she would regret it for the rest of her life. She looked at the exit path. She could just turn around, walk away, go home and sleep. It would be so easy. Then she saw him on the screen. He wasn't just arrogant. He was lonely up there. He was sitting in a tower of his own making, looking down on everyone. And he was wrong. He was so wrong about music. Music wasn't a wall you built to keep people out. It was a door you opened to let them in. Elena's feet moved before her brain could stop them. She squeezed past a family eating ice cream. Hey, watch it. A man grumbled as she bumped his shoulder. Sorry, she whispered, but she didn't stop. She pushed through the line of people near the barricades. The smell of popcorn and sweat filled her nose. I think someone's going up. A woman shouted from the back. The crowd began to part, sensing movement. A murmur rippled forward toward the stage. Who is it? I can't see. Is it a teacher? Julian heard the noise. He stopped mid-reach for the keys. He looked up, his eyes narrowing as he saw the parting crowd. He saw a figure walking toward the security gate. A security guard stepped forward, holding up a hand. He was a big guy with sunglasses. Ma'am, this area is restricted. You need a pass. Lena stopped. She was standing right in front of the stage, just a few feet away from Julian. Up close, the piano looked enormous, a shiny black beast. Julian looked down at her, his expression one of mild annoyance mixed with curiosity. I'm here for the challenge, Elena said. Her voice shook, but it was loud enough to be picked up by the microphones near the front of the stage. The guard looked at her, then at the mayor, who shrugged. The guard looked skeptical. He looked at her simple clothes, her tired face, her flour-dusted shoes. You sure, miss? This is live TV. You can't back out once you're up there. I'm sure, Alina said. She gripped the strap of her bag so hard, her knuckles turned white. Julian stood up slowly. He walked to the edge of the stage and looked down at her. He didn't offer a hand to help her up the stairs. He just looked. You? Julian asked. The word wasn't loud, but the silence of the square carried it to the back row. You are the baker, aren't you? The one from yesterday. Yes, Elena said. I work at Sweet Crumbs, and you think you can play my music? Julian asked. There was no mockery in his voice now, just a cold, hard curiosity. He wanted to see how far this delusion went. I'm going to try, Elena said. Let her up, Julian said, waving a hand dismissively. Let's see what happens. The guard opened the gate. Alina walked up the temporary stairs. Her legs felt like lead. Each step was a battle against the urge to run back down. As she reached the top of the stage, the sunlight hit her face directly. It was blinding. She blinked, trying to adjust. The roar of the crowd changed. It wasn't just a murmur anymore. It was a low rumble of shock. Hundreds of phones were raised, cameras flashing in her face. She felt exposed, naked. She felt like a fraud. She walked toward the piano. It sat there, gleaming. It was a Steinway, worth more money than she would make in 10 years of working at the bakery. The keys looked ivory white and perfect. Julian stepped back, giving her space. He leaned against the piano, crossing his arms. He looked at the camera operators, tilting his head slightly as if to say, Asterisk, watch this. It will be over in 10 seconds. Asterisk Alina reached into her bag. Her hand was trembling so badly, she fumbled with the zipper. She pulled out the crumpled stack of papers she had printed that morning. They were wrinkled, and the corners were bent from being in her pocket. She smoothed them out on top of the piano as best she could. She sat down on the bench. It was leather, soft and cool. It felt strange to be sitting there, looking out at the crowd instead of being part of it. The mayor stepped to the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a challenger. Alina, from Sweet Crumbs Bakery." There was a polite smattering of applause, but mostly people were craning their necks, waiting for the train wreck. They expected her to freeze up. They expected her to hit wrong notes and start crying. Julian leaned over her shoulder. He pointed to the music stand. "You know," he whispered, loud enough for the nearby microphones to catch, "if you need me to turn the page for you, just ask. Though I doubt we will get past the first line." Alina didn't look at him. She stared at the keys. They were so much more sensitive than her keyboard at home. The slightest touch would make a sound. She felt the sweat trickling down her back. She placed her hands on the keys. They looked pale against the black surface. "Take your time," Julian said, his voice dripping with false kindness. "There is no rush. The world is waiting." Lena closed her eyes for a brief second. She heard the wind. She heard the distant sound of a seagull. She remembered the feeling of the music at 4 a.m. in her living room. She remembered that this wasn't about being perfect. It was about being true. She opened her eyes. She looked at the sheet music. The notes were still there, intimidating and complex. But she knew the sound they made. She knew the story they told. She took a deep breath. The silence in the square was absolute. You could hear a pin drop. Julian crossed his arms tighter, ready to shake his head in disappointment. Alina pressed down on the first note. The first note that rang out wasn't a mistake, but it wasn't perfect either. It was a tiny bit late, a fraction of a second behind where the metronome would have clicked. The sound of the concert grand piano was massive compared to the electric keyboard Alina practiced on. It felt like the instrument was fighting back, vibrating against her fingertips with a power she wasn't used to. She played the opening phrase. It was shaky. Her fingers felt stiff and clumsy, like frozen sausages trying to dance. She missed a note in the second measure sharp where there should have been a natural. The sound clanged, a jarring dissonance that echoed through the square. From the side of the stage, Julian Vross let out a barely audible sigh. He uncrossed his arms and looked down at his shoes, already preparing the polite but dismissive speech he would give to end this farce. In the crowd, people shifted on their feet. A few teenagers snickered, convinced this was going to be a train wreck they could post on social media. Alina heard the mistake. Her face flushed hot with embarrassment. Panic tried to grab hold of her, urging her to lift her hands and run off the stage. But then, a strange calm washed over her. She realized that trying to be Julian Vross was impossible. She couldn't play with his precision. She didn't have his technique, so she stopped trying to be him. She slowed down. Instead of rushing to catch up to the tempo she missed, she took her time. She let the notes breathe. She approached the next measures not as a math problem to be solved, but as a story she needed to tell. Suddenly, the music changed. It wasn't the cold, robotic sound of a student recital. It became something else. Alina began to play the melody with a softness that felt like a whisper. She wasn't hitting the keys hard. She was caressing them. The piano, which had been fighting her, seemed to surrender. The rich, deep tones of the bass notes began to rumble through the stage floor, vibrating right into the chest of everyone listening. The snickering in the crowd stopped. Julian lifted his head. He had been expecting silence or a clumsy apology. Instead, he was hearing his own composition, but it sounded different. He wrote The Tempest to be a display of speed and aggression. It was meant to be a storm. But Alina was playing it like the eye of the storm, the quiet, dangerous center where the wind stops blowing. She reached a difficult run, a cascade of notes that usually sounded like hail on a tin roof. Her fingers didn't fly over the keys with machine-like speed. Instead, they lingered just a millisecond longer on certain notes. She emphasized the sad ones, the ones that hinted at a melody beneath the chaos. It was a risk. Any music teacher would have marked it wrong on a test, but it worked. A woman near the front row stopped chewing her gum. A man holding a coffee lowered his cup, forgetting to drink it. The sound was pulling them in. It wasn't just impressive, it was sad. It was heartbreaking. It sounded like a mother crying for a lost child or the feeling of standing alone on a cliff watching the sunset. It felt human. Julian Voss took a step closer to the piano. His condescending smirk was gone, replaced by a look of utter confusion. He watched Elena's hands. They were rough hands, hands that needed bread and scrubbed pans. They were not elegant hands, but they were obeying a command he hadn't written into the sheet music. She was playing the feeling of the piece, not just the notes. As she turned the page onto the second sheet, her confidence grew. She wasn't looking at the individual notes anymore. She was looking at the whole picture. Her foot pressed down on the sustain pedal, and the sound swelled, filling the entire square. It washed over the bakery windows, over the police cars, over the news cameras. The camera operators, who usually focused on wide shots of the crowd, began to zoom in. Not on her face, but on her hands. They captured the way her left hand walked down the keyboard in a slow, heavy rhythm, while her right hand danced frantically above it. It was a contradiction, just like the title of the song. A tempest isn't just wind, it's the deep, dark water underneath. The silence in the square was absolute now. The wind seemed to stop blowing out of respect. Even the seagulls had quieted down. There were hundreds of people standing there, but it felt like there was only one person in the world. Elena forgot where she was. She forgot about the challenge. She forgot about the money. She closed her eyes, letting her muscle memory take over. She remembered the late nights, the loneliness, the feeling of being invisible in a world that only noticed the rich and the famous. She poured all of that into the piano. She played every disappointment she had ever had, every dream she had buried to pay the rent, and the piano sang for her. She approached the climax of the 3 pages. This was the part where Julian usually played as fast as he could, showing off his blinding speed. Elena didn't have that speed. She couldn't play it that fast. So she played it with power. She struck the chords harder, making the piano strings hum. She built the tension slowly, agonizingly, until the air felt thick. Then she hit the final sequence. It wasn't a bang. It wasn't a crash. It was a gentle, descending run that ended on a single low note. She let her hands hover over the keys after the last note sounded, letting the vibration fade into the air until there was nothing left but silence. Elena opened her eyes. She sat there for a moment, her chest heaving, her hands trembling violently. She blinked, the spell of the music breaking, as the reality of where she was came rushing back. She looked down at her lap, terrified to look up. She assumed she had made a mistake. She assumed she had gone too slow, or that the emotion she felt hadn't translated to the audience. She waited for the laughter. She waited for Julian to say, "That was nice, dear, but you missed the tempo in the 3rd measure." But nobody laughed. No one spoke. The silence lasted for 5 seconds. 10 seconds. It was the heaviest silence the town square had ever known. It was the kind of silence that happens when something so profound occurs that words feel inadequate. On stage, Julian Voss was standing perfectly still. He was staring at the sheet music, then at the piano, then at Elena. His face was pale. For the first time in his career, he didn't know what to say. He had played The Tempest 1,000 times, and he had never made it sound like that. He had played it with his brain, but this girl had played it with her soul. She had crushed him. Slowly, a woman in the 3rd row began to clap. It wasn't a polite golf clap. It was a slow, rhythmic clap. Then a man joined in. Then the teenager who had been snickering earlier dropped his phone and started clapping. Within seconds, the quiet square exploded. It wasn't just applause. It was a roar. People were shouting, "Bravo," and "Encore." A few people were actually crying, moved by a music they didn't even know they could understand. The sound washed over Elena like a tidal wave. She stood up, her legs shaking so badly she had to hold onto the edge of the piano to keep from falling. She looked out at the sea of faces all turned up toward her. They weren't looking at a baker anymore. They were looking at an artist, and then she did something truly shocking. She looked straight at the camera, her eyes wide and wet with tears, and she turned to leave the stage. She didn't bow. She didn't ask for the prize. She just wanted to go home, but Julian Voss stepped in front of her, blocking her path. The applause in the town square was deafening. a wave of sound that crashed against the buildings and bounced back. Alina stood frozen, her hands still hovering near the keys. She wanted to disappear. The adrenaline that had fueled her playing was quickly turning into a cold, tight knot in her stomach. She felt exposed. She felt naked. She had just poured her deepest secrets into a public performance, and now everyone was staring at her. Waiting for a reaction she didn't know how to give, she tried to step back, to move away from the piano and run down the stairs and hide in her apartment. But Julian Voss was blocking her path. The world-famous pianist stood there, his face pale. For a moment, the arrogance had completely vanished. He looked at Alina not with the annoyance of a teacher dealing with a slow student, but with the confusion of a man seeing a ghost. He looked at her hands, then back at her face, as if trying to solve a puzzle that made no sense. The crowd quieted down, sensing the tension on stage. Julian moved to the microphone. The feedback squealed for a second, making everyone flinch. He tapped it, cleared his throat, and leaned in. For weeks, the media had been painting Julian as a villain, an elitist who hated regular people. They expected him to nitpick her performance. They expected him to say her tempo was off, or she missed that F sharp in the second measure. They wanted a controversy. Julian looked out at the hundreds of faces, then down at the sheet music still resting on the piano. He swallowed hard. "I have played The Tempest over 4,000 times, Julian said into the microphone. His voice was quiet, so the sound engineer had to turn up the volume. In conservatories, in concert halls, for kings and queens. I played it exactly as it was written. I played it perfectly." He paused, looking back at Alina, who was gripping the hem of her shirt, terrified. "But I was wrong," Julian said. The words hit the crowd like a physical weight. The silence was absolute. "I said art was about complexity. I said it was about discipline. I looked at this sheet music, and I saw math. I saw a challenge to the fingers." He turned to face Alina directly. "You didn't play the math," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "You played the pain. You played the silence between the notes. I don't know how you did it. I don't know how you took a piece of technical nonsense and turned it into a prayer. But what you just did was better than anything I have ever done." Gasp rippled through the crowd. The reporters near the stage went wild, their cameras flashing rapidly. Julian Voss, the man who never apologized, the man who never admitted defeat, was admitting that he had been beaten. "You win," Julian said simply. "The money is yours. Every cent. And I apologize. For the challenge and for the arrogance." He stepped away from the microphone and gestured for Alina to take his place. He wasn't blocking her exit anymore. He was opening the door for her. The crowd roared again, louder this time. They were cheering for the baker, the underdog, the girl who had humbled a giant. They were cheering for the impossible. But Alina didn't go to the microphone. She didn't raise her hands in victory. She looked at Julian, saw the humiliation mixed with genuine respect in his eyes, and she realized that taking his money wasn't the victory she wanted. It didn't fix the divide he had created. She shook her head. "No," she said, her voice barely picked up by the mic. "Keep your money." The cheering stopped instantly. Julian looked confused. "What?" "I didn't do this for money," Alina said, her voice gaining strength. "I did it because you told us that we couldn't understand you, that our lives were too simple to feel real art. I proved that you were wrong about us. That's enough." She looked out at the sea of people who worked in diners, people who fished for a living, people who cleaned floors. "We don't need you to pay us to care about music. We just need you to stop telling us we aren't good enough." With that, she turned and walked past him. She walked down the stairs of the stage. The security guard, the same one who had doubted her earlier, opened the gate with a wide smile. As she walked through the crowd, people didn't mob her. They just reached out, patting her on the back, touching her arm like she was a saint who had just performed a miracle. She walked all the way back to her apartment, got into bed, and slept for 12 hours straight. The aftermath, however, was just beginning. By the next morning, the video of Alina's performance had gone viral. It wasn't just a local story anymore. It was a global sensation. The clip of her sitting at the grand piano in her flower-dusted clothes, playing with a raw emotion that made professionals weep, had been viewed 50 million times. The headlines were shocking. The baker who broke the piano. Asterisk, the day Julian Voss lost his ego. Asterisk, critics from the biggest newspapers were arguing about her technique. Some called it unrefined, while others called it the most important interpretation of the decade. Record labels started calling the bakery. Managers wanted to sign her. Talk shows offered to fly her to New York, put her up in luxury hotels, and give her makeover. They saw a goldmine. They saw a Cinderella story they could package and sell. They wanted her to record albums, go on tour, and become the next big thing. Alina sat in the back room of the bakery, listening to the voicemails on her phone. She felt a strange pressure. The world wanted her to change. They wanted her to stop being Alina the baker and become Alina the prodigy. They wanted her to buy fancy dresses and hire a voice coach. They wanted her to leave Port Haven and never look back. 2 weeks later, a black limousine pulled up outside the bakery. Julian Voss stepped out. He wasn't wearing a suit this time. He was wearing jeans and a t-shirt. He looked like a regular guy, maybe a little tired around the eyes. He walked into the bakery. The bell chimed, and the few customers inside froze. Julian ignored them. He walked straight to the counter, where Alina was decorating a cake. "I have a proposal," Julian said without saying hello. "I'm not signing a contract," Alina said, not looking up from her icing flowers. "I like my job." "I'm not asking you to sign a contract," Julian said. "I'm asking for a job?" Alina finally looked up. "Excuse me?" Julian leaned on the counter, his elbows resting on the surface that was covered in flour. "I went back to the city. I tried to practice. But every time I touched the keys, I heard you. I heard the ghost of what you played. I realized. I forgot why I started playing. I stopped playing for the music and started playing for the applause. I got lost," sighed, looking around the small shop. "I'm quitting the tour. I'm taking a year off. I want to remember what it feels like to play something real." He looked at Alina intensely. "I have money." "Too much money?" "You refuse to take it for yourself. So let me spend it on this. I want to turn this bakery into a music school. Not for prodigies. Not for kids like me who start lessons at age 3. For the kids in this town who have talent but no money for lessons. For the kids who just want to play." He pointed to the back room. "I'll build a soundproof studio in the back. You can keep baking. But you will teach them how to listen. You will teach them what you showed me." Lena looked at him. She looked for the arrogance, but it was gone. In its place was a man who had been humbled, who had been knocked off his pedestal, and was trying to build a ladder back up to humanity. "You want to teach here?" Alina asked. "You?" "The famous Julian Voss." "I want to learn," Julian corrected her, "and maybe teach a little technique. But mostly I want to be in a place where the music matters more than the sheet music." Alina looked around her shop. She thought about the kids in town who hung out on the streets, bored and restless. She thought about her grandmother's old piano gathering dust. She thought about how music had saved her lonely nights, and how it could save others. "Okay," Lena said slowly. "But you have to sweep the floors at the end of the night. And you can't complain about the flour." Julian smiled a genuine warm smile that reached his eyes. "Deal." The shock of the story wasn't that a baker played the piano well. The shock was that the encounter changed the world of classical music forever. The Vrossalina School of Music opened 6 months later in the back of that little bakery. It became famous for producing students who played with heart, not just technique. As for Julian, he never regained his title as the king of cold perfection, became something better, a teacher, a humble student of art, and a friend who mopped floors every Tuesday night. And Alina. She kept baking. But sometimes, when the ovens were cooling down and the shop was quiet, she would walk to the piano in the back room. She would sit down, and Julian would stop sweeping to listen. She would play not for a crowd and not for a challenge, but for the simple, pure joy of the sound. And in those moments, she wasn't a simple woman or a star. She was just free.